Today, we're going to be talking about a fairly controversial topic. It's the kind of one that gets you banned from social media and especially YouTube. We're going to be talking about transgenderism. What we're going to do today is a little bit different. We're going to talk about the different perspectives. We're going to try to effectively define this topic. And then we're also going to talk about what is the best way to respond with respect to a lot of the arguments that we see surrounding transgenderism in today's culture, today's schools, Hollywood, etc. So we're going to be discussing those issues as carefully as we possibly can, while at the same time making sure that we're equipping you with the best arguments to be able to make on behalf of what you believe, on behalf of your faith, on behalf of children. All that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument, where we make the arguments to defend a free society.
We were discussing what today's topic would be last week, and I thought that this would be an appropriate topic for everyone that was listening, just due to the nature of its popularity and the conversation taking place here in the United States. We knew going into this that there was a possibility that, YouTube could take the video down. But we thought it was important enough to still talk about it, and we were committed to discussing this in a truthful way that we find to be honest and accurate. And so if we do get taken down by YouTube, so be it. I mean, we have other methods of uploading our video content, so we'll take that process whenever we need to. But we want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for clicking in, because, these tougher conversations are ones that may be less entertaining to listen to, but we hope that this conversation will be interesting. So let's get started. And if you have something you want to share, drop it in the comments on YouTube, or write us a review on Apple Podcasts. But thanks so much for listening. I'm excited for today's conversation. I think we're going to work out some difficult subjects, and hopefully you're going to walk away with some actionable points that you can use in conversation.
Okay, let's go around, as always, do our quick introductions here. I'm Nick Freitas, your host, current member of the Virginia House of Delegates, former Green Beret, and most importantly, husband to this beautiful lady, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And, of course, our resident historian and prognosticator of all things politics within the country, Christian Hines.
Hello. The hair's starting to grow back.
No, you need to shave it again.
I like it bald.
I like the biker gang look for you, Christian. It's a good one. And then, as always, our producer, Nick Hamilton, producer of not only this show, but several other successful shows. So we're lucky to have him.
Excited for today's conversation, Nick.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and set the stage here. We have a clip that we want to see, and part of this clip was banned. We'll let you know right up front, and we're not going to be able to show that part for obvious reasons. But this was a particular gentleman, Walt Heyer, who had actually gone through transition surgery.
The full surgery.
The full surgery, and he did it early on. He actually went through this in the early 80s. So this is someone that has kind of gone through the whole lifespan of what it was like starting off as a young child. I think he has some interesting points to make. And so we're going to go ahead and show a few clips from this this discussion that he had with the Heritage Foundation, and we're going to go ahead and weigh in. And so let's go ahead and get the first clip started.
Affirming children into a cross-gender identity is child abuse. Let's be honest. It's not physical abuse, but it's psychological abuse. It's emotional abuse, and it's sexual abuse. We cannot kid ourselves any longer, and our children are being destroyed. I, myself, was cross-dressed at the age of 4, 1944, 74 years ago. And as a result of that, I became gender distressed, to the point to where I underwent gender reassignment surgery after struggling because of being cross-dressed in a purple dress at the age of 4. We cannot ignore how devastating it is to young people to cross-dress them and affirm them. Do not kid yourselves. I'm here as a witness to this, that I'm still today stand before you with a mutilated body and a life that was destroyed in many ways, redeemed by Christ, certainly, but destroyed because I was affirmed and told how cute I looked, how wonderful it was, and went to a gender therapist who said, all you need to do is have hormones and reassignment surgery. That was in 1981. I underwent the surgery in 1983 because they said this is the treatment for gender confusion. Wrong.
First of all, I mean, I think that's fascinating. He's talking about 1944. This World War II is going on.
He's the same age as my grandfather.
Well, that's when somebody dressed him up and affirmed him as a girl.
Yeah.
And
At age 4.
At age 4. And it wasn't until he was something like 42 or something. And he actually had a wife and kids. When it finally came to a head and he was struggling so much with gender dysphoria that he went to this doctor.
Now, a lot of the argument you see coming from the left is, well, yeah, the reason why he was struggling with it is because all of you bigots on the right weren't willing to accept what, he really was.
That is always the argument.
And what I don't understand here is, again, if at 4 years old, adults, right, presumably his parents, but who knows who else, is dressing him up in a dress and affirming that. I mean, at what level do you say, okay, how much of this is influence? Now, the left will come back and say, well, if they dress him up as a little boy and affirm that, you wouldn't have had a problem with it. But again, this goes to this larger conversation that really started in the 50s with respect to a lot of like the academic work on trying to separate gender from biological sex. But I mean, is it still fair to say at this day and age that there is a distinction when you affirm someone's, again, they call it gender affirmation, but wait a second, if someone is biologically male or biologically female, isn't that affirming their gender?
It is. The language is really, really strange because if you're looking at within the psychological, community, you have this term. It's called gender conversion therapy. That is very negative. They hate it. You have to sign a waiver saying you'll never use it. Gender conversion therapy basically affirms the biological gender, but gender affirmation therapy affirms the mental gender. And basically, I kind of look at that and go, that's conversion therapy because you're converting an entire biological body over to reflect what is in the mind.
Well, and I think that's one of the important distinctions. And again, the reason why there's been such a push lately to kind of distinguish between gender and sex is this idea that you're separating the two things. And just so we're all clear, as best I understand, when we talk about gender versus sex and the way that advocates within the trans movement discuss it, is that sex is biological, which is to say that it is based off of your chromosomes or those characteristics which are associated with male male or female, man or woman. And then gender is a spectrum because it's based off of essentially characteristics that we generally associate with masculinity or femininity. Now, I would argue that all of us grew up in an era, right? Most of us grew, Tina and I, we were, born in the late 70s. Right, you guys are much younger. We won't go into it, but it was this idea that we always knew that there were differing degrees of masculinity and different degrees of femininity. Mm-hmm. But when we were growing up, nobody thought, or I shouldn't say nobody. Obviously, some people. Society in general basically said, well, okay, that is a woman or that is a girl that has certain masculine traits.
Well, we used to have
or characteristics.
We used to call her a tomboy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you had a guy that had more feminine traits, but again, there was always a distinction there is like, okay, that is a feminine trait being, realized by a man, or that is a, masculine trait being realized by a woman. But again, I don't recall anybody thinking, therefore that makes you.
No, back then it was quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Back then there was a lot of affirmation surrounding, if you're a boy and you like to play with dolls, that's okay. It doesn't make you less of a man.
Yeah.
You're just going to be a great dad. You're going to have babies and you're going to know how to treat them because you love dolls.
Yeah.
If you're a girl who loves to go hunting and fishing and loves to build things like me, you're a tomboy and you're going to go out and do all kinds of things. And boys might not think you belong in that arena, but you can because you're a woman and women can do this too.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make you less of a woman. And the problem is now when they start seeing these traits, they go, oh, well, maybe you're a man. Oh, well, maybe you're a woman. And there is no longer you can be a woman and still do this, or you can be a man and still do that. Now they are basically telling you, well, something's wrong with you since you like this. It must mean that you're a woman or you're a man. It must mean that deep down.
And that's
and
a
then they start pushing it, and they start trying to get you to explore it, and that's where it starts.
Well,
that's where it goes.
Again, I think it's a fascinating point. And again, we're going to try to be very careful on this episode with who they are. But essentially, there used to be, Tina's absolutely right. There used to be this distinction where it was just because, again, a woman liked to, hunt or fish didn't make her any less of a woman. Just because a guy liked to, bake pies didn't make him any less of a guy. And now it's crazy to me because there were certain immutable characteristics with respect to male and female, and that had to do with your biology. Mm-hmm. And these other characteristics might be generally associated with masculinity or femininity, but it didn't take away from the fact that you were still a real man or you were still a real woman. And now, to your point, and I do think that's an important distinction to make, now to your point, that whole narrative's been flipped. Mm-hmm. And now we're supposed to say, well, no, now you must actually be a woman, or you must actually be a man. And I think that's an interesting component. Let's go ahead and look at the next clip here.
It's destructive. It's not treatment. It's further abuse. This is the physical abuse. Cutting off body parts and filling someone with hormones is one of the most destructive things you can do. And it's not repairable. There's things that cannot be restored. I'm here as a witness to tell you we have to stop this nonsense.
Here's another point that I think interesting, because a lot of the same people that I see coming down on one side of this debate are also very much anti-GMO, they're very whole foods. They're very about holistic approaches to medicine. They're very about like naturalism when it comes to, the foods that they eat or the things that they consume. And there's this, on one side, there's this whole idea of like a natural approach, nature knows best. Except when it comes to this issue, and then all of a sudden it's, how many pharmaceuticals can we pump into you to force your body to stop doing the thing that your body is naturally doing? And I find that
the fact that it's naturally inclined to do those things, there is a reason why the female body needs a certain combination of hormones, and the male body needs a certain combination of hormones in order to maintain bone density, in order to maintain a certain level of health, cardiovascular health. There are a lot of it is hormones are very powerful things. Ask me
That's
how
why
I know.
they ban them in sports.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
We were having a discussion right before the show started about how, if women were injecting themselves with the degree of testosterone that a man has naturally, and then competed in a sporting competition, she would be expelled for
Juicing.
So what I find most interesting about this discussion, though, from the left's viewpoint, are the things that make it such a powerful tool. I don't want to say tool, because I don't want to act like anybody that doesn't hold the same view that, say, a conservative has on this is an inherently bad person, because I don't think that's the case. The biggest difference between the right and the left is the right traditionally views the left as supporting bad policies, whereas the left traditionally views the right as literally being evil. So I don't want to accuse the left of literally being evil.
Yeah.
But what I find so fascinating about what makes leftist arguments on cultural issues like this so politically successful is the emphasis on a combination of the civil liberties argument and the, we are defending weak people and you're trying to attack weak people. You saw this over the past decade on the general LGBT stuff, where the left's argument was a very successful argument. It certainly won in the courts, and I would also argue it largely won in public opinion, which is that, well, the right are literally being bigots. They hate these people, and we're standing up and defending them. Why do you want to impose your will on somebody? That was the argument over and over again from the left. on things like the marriage thing. Why do you want to impose your will on people? You know, you just want to force people to live the way that you want. And that's a very powerful argument, especially I would argue in this country, which is a very individualistic country. And I say that as a compliment. The left usually likes to say it as a negative thing, but but in this country, we largely, throughout most of history, we've definitely not always done it, but we've largely moved towards a direction of live and let live. Not universally, but this country was largely founded on those principles, and we've moved in that direction. And so when the left can take that narrative and apply it to something like this situation, suddenly it's the conservative is now on the back foot and being accused of you're trying to impose your will on somebody.
And I think what we're concerned about in this situation is not the live and let live, it's the push.
So it does seem to me like the biggest transition in the way the right has responded is that it was pretty much live and let live all the way up until they started wanting to make this commonplace for children. And so it's when you enter this in with children and affirming these procedures and these medical procedures for children that we started to go, wait a minute, guys, we're going to have children choosing their gender at this very young age when, I mean, they can't even brush their teeth properly.
To play devil's advocate for just a brief moment, I would challenge you a little bit on the idea that until it got to children, and by the way, now that we've gotten to this point, like, it is pretty clear that the battle lines are being drawn. But to challenge your point about the idea that until it got to that point, the right's position was live and let live, I don't really think it was.
I guess you're right. I guess I would say,
can you go into that some more, Christian?
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it's important for this fight, because there's a lot of people out there that didn't share the right's position on LGBT stuff until 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
There were a lot of people that supported the court rulings on things like gay marriage and stuff like that. There's a lot of people in the center politically that are either apolitical or they're center right or they're center left or they're just plain old centrists that traditionally looked at the right's position on these sort of culture things and was like, you guys are bigots. You guys are trying to impose your will on people. And I'm not about that. And I feel like in order for us to win this fight, because this is no longer about, the right is not trying to impose, even if you believed previously, and I actually do to some degree, that the right was, quote unquote, pushing, their will on people historically on this, I don't think that's the case now at all. It is completely script now. The script has been completely flipped now. It is the left that is trying to impose an ideology on people, and there needs to be a pushback against that. So in order for the right to win this fight, because it has to be won, we have to be able to re-engage with those people that completely deserted the right on the culture war issue on this 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and be able to explain to them that I am not coming from a position where I'm saying I have anything against or that I am, against somebody that doesn't share the same worldview as me when it comes to LGBT stuff. But I definitely have an issue when you go to children and you say, we need to be allowed to teach them about sex and gender in third grade. I have a major issue with that. And I think the average person does too. But I also feel like there needs to be a logical, rational way to engage with those people. Because if we lead out of the gate and we start saying, well, anybody that is pushing this, has sinister motivations, and they're just, trying to do really nefarious stuff. If we lead out of the gate with that, and I feel like we're going to alienate people that we would otherwise be able to win over.
Well, one thing that I'm interested in, I'm going to move us into the making the argument section right now. I want to know who, a situation that we would be having this conversation with friends or family. And Nick, to start us out, you've got a story to share, and let me tee you up with this to help us define exactly what transgenderism is so that when we're having these conversations, we can understand the other person's perspective. But you've got a story for us here.
Well, yeah, because it really is a good question. And you kind of saw elements of this with the whole Supreme Court nomination hearings, right? Like, define what a woman is. And nobody wanted to do it. And then the left responded with, well, that's a stupid question. Like, okay, but can you do it? And so I want to give an example of something that happened within the Virginia legislature, because there was a bill coming forward presented by a Democrat. I can't remember who the patron was, but it had to do with public school policy with respect to transgenderism. And one of the, I think it was over on the Senate, and one of the senators said, I'm looking through the bill here right now. Can you provide me a definition of transgender? And from what I understand, the patron said, well, no, I'm going to leave that to our friends with Equality Virginia, who are also here to testify on behalf of the bill. So Equality Virginia is one of the I would argue probably the biggest pro-LGBTQ advocacy group.
Them, maybe the ACLU.
Yeah. But Equality Virginia is specifically focused on this issue. This is their issue, right, is LGBTQ issues and equality. So, okay, Equality Virginia, can you give us a definition of transgender there? And they're like, oh, well, no, the bill directs the Department of Education to provide that definition. And so the senators looking at him going, wait a second. So you want me to vote on a bill, and the whole purpose of the bill is focusing around this issue of transgenderism and how we treat, trans children in the public school system. You provide no definition. I ask you what the definition is. You refer to your experts. The experts don't want to give a definition. And then it's just going to be the Department of Education determining what this looks like. So obviously that's potentially problematic, but I think it's also instructive to say that you had, advocates right there that were very uncomfortable with providing a fixed definition of transgender.
You know why, right?
Well,
I think we all know why, because at the end of the day, once you provide a definition, that definition can be criticized and you can investigate it.
You can have a discussion on whether or not to mention the fact that whenever you define something, you run the risk of potentially excluding something else. Honestly, and they are very, very concerned about that, because this has been like, a forever changing thing. But I looked it up. I said, okay, what is a working definition? And this is one that I've always, when someone has always asked me, what is transgenderism? This is one I've always associated with it. It's denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth sex. Now, a couple of important things here, and this goes back to what I was mentioning in the first segment, right? Is that it has been fairly recent that there has been this distinction between gender and sex, in the sense that if your gender identity does not correspond with your birth sex, then you're really then there's something wrong with your birth sex, right? It's not that your psychological reality is problematic. It's that the objective physical reality is problematic. And so that's been a big part of the movement, because as Tina was pointing out earlier, it used to be that, okay, the boy played with dolls, that didn't make him less of a boy. The girl played with, trucks, that didn't make her less of a girl. And now that dynamic's flipped, and we're saying that if these characteristics manifest themselves in some way, then it might mean that you actually, you're a woman, or actually you're a man. And that's the part that's been a big departure. But that's essentially what I think we're debating and arguing here when these issues come up and we talk about what is transgender. It's somebody who's, psychological reality does not comport with their biological reality.
Body dysmorphia. And there's also an issue where, people will identify as being an amputee. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, the regimen is very different for someone who identifies as female, even though their biological sex is male. It's straight to, let's just, alter your body. Whereas if you identify as an amputee and you really want your arm taken off, they go through a regimen to try to get you to accept the arm. Yeah. And I find it really interesting that a lot of the same folks, and when we say they, it's the same they, many people in the media and in our society today, there was a big body positivity push. You all remember,
there still is.
Oh yeah, big time.
Healthy at any size, beautiful at any size, love the body you're in. And this was a massive push and is still a big push. And this usually has to do with size, a weight. But what's interesting to me is it does not work in relation to this. There is no love the body you're in. There is no accept the body you're in, or love yourself for what you are. It's, I need to make some surgical alterations. Now, to be fair, people surgically alter their bodies all the time. But when you're talking about some of these side effects, which I've been looking into, there's a very big difference. And
Sure.
Well, usually what people are doing, and when they get alterations to their body now, they're usually trying to, enhance some sort of
Make
feature
themselves look better.
that we're usually trying to enhance some sort of feature or whatnot that's already associated with, their being a man or a woman. But when you're going through a gender transition operation where now we are trying to use the anatomy that you have and then fundamentally alter and change it from something that it was never intended to be in order to try to replicate the opposite of the genitalia that you possess. Okay, now we're talking about a pretty significant distinction between someone that went out
Cosmetic surgery.
and got some,
Right.
collagen in the cheeks, right? So
or breast implants. And if there is something that has gone wrong in some of those procedures, like breast implants or whatever they may be, it's plastered all over the news that
you
this
know
is a
about it.
horrible
Right.
thing. This happened, and it is pushed, but no one talks about things like fistulas. Go take a look at what that is online.
I don't think I want
I
to.
won't go into it, but it's common.
Just to back up real quick, I might have missed this. What was the bill in the Virginia General Assembly aiming to do?
Oh, it was. I was going to set up like transgender bathroom policy
Okay.
and things like that within the public school system. And so again, they were trying to figure out a way to be
Was
able to
this
address
pre or post Loudon?
This is pre-Loudon. Pre-Loudon.
How do you think that's changed things?
By the way, for the audience who
Yeah.
does not keep up to date with Virginia politics 24/7, do you want to briefly go into
So
that?
what happened in Loudon is you actually had a situation in Loudon. So one of the concerns with the whole transgender bathroom bill was this idea that you're going to allow, boys to basically, change and share the girls' locker room. There could potentially be issues with this. And the left kind of mocked conservatives who were saying, okay, so you're telling me a 16-year-old boy isn't going to figure out that they can go shower with the girls' volleyball team if you pass them like, oh, you're right. They would undergo the horrible, ridicule that they would receive and everything else just to do that. Just because you're a perv doesn't mean they. And we're like, no, we're not saying everybody's going to do that. We're saying that this could potentially cause problems. And of course, we got mocked and laughed at. Well, there was a situation up in Loudoun County in one of the schools where a trans woman. And we weren't even sure if he was a trans woman because he was a boy that was wearing a dress and the whole deal. Well, him and this girl had engaged in different sexual activities within the bathroom. He wanted to do some things she didn't want to do. He then physically forced her to do it and raped her. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, this came up later at a Loudoun County School Board meeting. And
This was recent, by the way.
This is recent. We're talking like last year or year and a half ago. And what happened was the superintendent, I think it was the head of the school board, asked the superintendent, well, have there been any cases of, violence in a bathroom or any sort of issues like this that these, and essentially is that these bigoted, ignorant parents are concerned about? And the superintendent said no. And the father of the daughter who had been raped basically stood up and called BS on this and was escorted out and arrested by the police. And that ended up being one of the cases that the Biden Department of Justice used. And that's where the
infamous letter that was saying
domestic
that parents
terrorism.
were domestic terrorists.
Yeah.
For the audience sitting at home, this was the story, especially if you don't live in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but you keep at least a little bit up to date with politics around the country. This was the issue that at the 11th hour, almost literally at the 11th hour, blew up right before the 2021 elections.
Yeah.
And in some ways, obviously, there's a million factors that are at place, but this is one of the factors that very well might have pushed Glenn Youngkin across the finish line.
But I did want to point out that at the time when this happened, that father, no one really knew why he was thrown out because they were also discussing CRT at the time.
Yeah.
And so what I saw a lot on social media from a lot of folks on the left is
That he was a racist.
They would show the video of the father and be like, look at this hillbilly, look at this. And because he's struggling with the police, his shirt's getting pulled up and it's a pretty humiliating shot. And I saw people that I know in my own, people I know who were saying, look, the right are just such a bunch of hillbillies and look at this bigoted hick out there, doing this because he doesn't like black people. Well, when you later on find out that what he was there for had nothing to do with CRT, it had to do with the fact that his daughter was raped. Mm-hmm. And now he's running for office.
Yeah. Well, and again, this goes back into I mean, the whole question, right, is how do we actually define transgenderism? And I think that based off of the definition I read, I think there's two components here. One is it is interesting when somebody does not want to define either transgender or woman or man. And at some point you're looking at this going, okay, if you really have that big a problem doing this, I'm starting to suspect there's an agenda beyond, just greater understanding and compassion for people. And then the second part of this is if you can't give us a definition, how exactly are we supposed to pass laws?
I don't
that's the
understand
feature, not a
why.
bug.
Yeah.
I don't understand why there is such a push for this issue when they can't even define it, and they won't define it to pass a bill.
Well, now they think that you've got to be a biologist to define woman.
Well,
So
So
We
why
have a
has there
big
been such
problem.
a push to advance this?
this is something I've thought a lot about. Like, why has there been such a push specifically with transgenderism? And you could argue that it's some people say it's an incredibly small portion of the population.
I mean, it is, but
But that
no,
doesn't.
not anymore. Not anymore. When you look at the numbers now, it is now a fad.
okay. So with
It is a
that is
fad.
true with Zoomers. It is, which is basically anybody younger than myself or Hamilton.
Yeah.
Hamilton and I are like the youngest of the millennials.
Yeah. Right.
So with anybody younger than us, and I'm 28, he's
27.
You're 27. Okay, so with anybody younger than us, the polling has shown that it's somewhere from like a third at the high end to like 20% at the low end of Zoomers
Well, they're
identify
saying like a
as
non-binary.
Yeah,
and,
so
fluid.
So there's a
and-
Well, they-
component of that, but what I really think, and I think that Nick might agree to some degree in terms of like the push for it, gets back to what we were briefly talking about earlier with, I think it's twofold. I think it's that civil liberties component, and I think it's we're defending vulnerable people.
I think that. So let's look at this from the left's perspective for a second, right? So obviously the people at this table kind of view this situation differently, all right? But not assuming that everyone that we disagree with is a bad person, right? Because we don't want to do that. What are the possible motivations for doing this? Well, I think Christian's point about the civil liberties side is that if you are on the left and you see yourself as someone that is trying to stand up for a vulnerable group, right? One of the dumbest arguments I hear people using is like, oh, it's just a small percentage of the population. That has no moral bearing.
That is a terrible
Yeah,
argument.
it's a terrible
by
argument. It
the
has
way.
no moral bearing.
And it's
I
also
don't
not
care if
true anymore.
Yeah, I don't care. I don't care if it's one person, right? If someone is being, oppressed or, or having violence visited upon them or being, treated in a bigoted fashion, that's wrong. If it's one person, that's wrong, right? So obviously the left is looking at this going, we have this small group of people that are in their minds, they're vulnerable, right? They don't have a great deal of like wealth or political power, all this other stuff. And so this is someone we're like, well, this is a vulnerable victim group, right? They're part of the oppressed, pantheon. And so they're going to come in and defend them, right? And take away the transgender, the larger argument here from a scientific standpoint or whatnot. If you just look at the left's motivation with wanting to protect what they perceive to be as a vulnerable, oppressed group, there is nothing wrong with that motivation. There's nothing wrong with that motivation. That's one. Two, I do believe that there's another motivation, right? So I want to be careful about this. I'm not assigning this motivation to any particular individual or group. I'm saying it is a potential motivation. There are people that they have never liked or approved of certain sexual norms, which are largely informed by religious communities.
Sure.
Whether it's, in the United States, that's largely been Judeo-Christian values. But it could be Muslim values. It could be Sikh values. It could be, Orthodox Jewish values. Right? There's all kinds of, generally speaking, most of your world religions, especially like your larger world religions, have certain sexual norms with respect to when it is appropriate to have sex and between who.
Or when to discuss it with people
Yeah,
too.
or when it's or with who. There's another group of the population that thinks that's totally inappropriate. And they think that if it, again, love is love. If it feels good, do it, right? There's all these other things. And they might make some distinctions between adult and child, right? Or they might make some other distinctions, and even then there's some people that don't even make that distinction, right? But if they believe that all sexual activity between, let's say, consenting adults is appropriate, right? They don't just believe it's appropriate. They actually believe it's something that should be, that has the same moral footing within society. And so this isn't simply a question of, are there any legal prohibitions on doing this, right? Because that's the part where Christian goes back to. There's conservatives, I would say probably like a lot of us, who are very liberty-oriented conservatives, where we would say, look, my faith dictates that this is the appropriate sexual behavior, right? It's between a man and a woman within the confines of marriage, and that's appropriate sexual behavior. Sure. And we would even say that it's not just between a man and woman, it has to be between husband and wife for us to look at it as, well, no, that's morally, appropriate. That doesn't mean I think the government should then come in and punish somebody for engaging in sexual activity that I would find, wrong within my faith. Okay, so that's a distinction. But one of the motivations here, I believe, is people that are saying essentially, I don't agree with those moral conventions. I think those moral conventions are wrong. And the attempt is to elevate any sort of sexual activity as being on the same moral plane. You can't do that by simply saying, we
leave me alone. Please stop oppressing me.
Yeah.
It needs to be, if you don't agree, that's where we're getting to.
Yeah.
It's no longer leave me alone. Please stop oppressing me.
Yeah.
It's, if you don't agree with me, you are a bad person.
Yeah.
It
Or
goes
that's a
back
form
to what
of
I was
oppression.
saying. It goes back to what I was saying before, that I think, and there's tons of evidence of this. You could just go online. There's the right traditionally, I'm not saying everybody, but the right as a block of collection of ideas traditionally views left-wing ideas as very misguided and incorrect. The left traditionally views the right as literally evil. And when you approach things from that perspective, it is not hard for you to go from point A, which is leave me alone, stop oppressing me, to you are a bad person if you don't agree with me.
Yeah.
Because you're already starting from a position where you immediately assume the person on the other side is a bad person, which is what the left routinely does. That's why we're always called racist, bigoted, homophobic,
even when we're not displaying
sexist.
any activities that would.
Just to clarify, you're saying that one of the potential reasons that we could be seeing such a push for this issue is that it is an opportunity to push back up against the moral guidelines of Judeo-Christian values or any moral system.
I think there's two. I think there's
Pushing
two
back
large
against dogma.
I think there's two large categories right now. There's probably an infinite number of other types of motivations and whatnot, but I think two large categories is, on one side you see there's an inclination to defend people who you believe are vulnerable and oppressed, and if the nature of their vulnerability is surrounding transgenderism, then you're going to then you feel like you're defending them by coming to their rescue and affirming the way that they feel about themselves. Right now, again, reasonable people can disagree about the biological or scientific nature and what is the best approach.
We're talking about the politics right now.
The best approach. But it's important to understand that if you are dealing with somebody that their motivation is to want to protect someone that they perceive as vulnerable, that's not a bad motivation.
No.
You might not agree with what they're doing or whatnot, but that's not a bad motivation. I think there's another group that this is a very, very genuine pushback against certain, and it's usually from religious populations, the values within the religious, and the only way that they can truly push back against them in their feeling to create a more equitable society is they have to either diminish those or they have to elevate a certain view of human sexuality and make it all on the same moral plane.
I give both of those to the reasoning for both of those examples there. I struggle to understand why those two objectives should play themselves out in schools.
Oh, so that's a great question. And here's, because we saw this with the whole, don't say gay bill in Florida, right? Which was not a bill that said you could not say gay. That's not what it was. It essentially said that there are certain topics on sex that you're not going to discuss with kids kindergarten through third grade, right? That's what the bill actually did. But a lot of people within the LGBT community or activist community said that this is essentially, you're creating a scenario where teachers are going to not know what they can discuss or how they can discuss it. If you have a gay teacher, right, who talks about their, as a woman and they talk about their wife, have you run afoul of that legislation? Well, again, if you actually look at the bill, nothing was in there. It was talking about a part of the curriculum, right? It was a part of classroom instruction. There was no prohibition on whether or not you talked about, your gay spouse or something like that, right? So let's just clarify that. But the reason why this will continue to be an issue is that if you believe that this is about making sure that we have a fair and equitable society where everybody is treated equally, then whatever personal decisions someone might have made about their sex or their gender or their sexual orientation, although that term has fallen out of favor now as well, who they're sexually attracted to, right? If you're saying you can't discuss this at a certain level, well, then there's an implication that there's something wrong with that you can't discuss with a child, where you can talk about mommy and daddy, right? Why can't you talk about mommy and mommy? Or why can't you talk about daddy or daddy? Or why can't you talk about non-binary, they, them?
So you see this a lot, and we've already shown a few clips of this before in previous episodes, but this is why, like, if you go onto Libs of TikTok, there's so many examples of this, ironically enough, usually from public school teachers, but there's so many examples of this where people on the left, and I find it so fascinating, where they say, well, heterosexuality is pushed on people from a very young age, because the starting point that they're coming from is basically what you would call, psychologically, like a blank slate.
Yeah.
Which is the idea that everybody starts off with nothing. And those things, and your beliefs, your worldviews, your personality traits, everything that it makes you is built up over time through outside pressures, like through society. It's the idea that there isn't really any nature; it's all nurture. Nurture is the only thing that determines everything that becomes you eventually, from a psychological perspective. And I don't really think the left, like, I don't think these people in Libs of TikTok are really, like, thinking this through. I just think that's kind of like the position that they're starting from, which is why you see them make claims that to a conservative just sound utterly ridiculous.
Yeah.
A conservative will hear somebody on, through Libs of TikTok say, heterosexuality is pushed on people from a very young age, and we need to be able to do the same thing. It's not fair for, Florida to say we can't push this on people, but you can push heterosexuality on people. And now a conservative would say that sounds insane.
It just seems like to me that the left has no interest in any moral guidelines whatsoever.
Oh, I would totally disagree with that.
Yeah,
I would totally disagree with that. What it is it's not that they don't have any interest in any sort of moral guidelines. Talking about gender identity and transitioning and all that is a part of their moral guidelines. That's a part of pushing back what they see as the current moral guidelines, which they believe in many cases are a manifestation of white patriarchal oppressor class systems.
So what's the foundation for the moral guidelines which they espouse through this conversation?
Postmodernism.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know that you can use postmodern. I think postmodernism influences it, but I don't think you can use it as a groundwork for for a moral code or a moral law.
Oh, no, I agree.
Yeah. but I think some of it is this is kind of the interesting point. And I can't claim to totally know the answer, but as best I can figure out, it seems like some of this is either an attempt to alter existing codes of morality, which generally have come from Judeo-Christian values or some sort of religious belief, right? It doesn't even need to be Judeo-Christian necessarily, but some sort of religious belief. Because in order to have an objective moral law, you generally have to have an objective moral law giver, right? That is why a lot of those moral codes. Now, other people would argue that some of those moral codes just come about as almost through like a series of democratic processes, like over time that have kind of evolved, right? So I don't kill you and take your stuff because I don't want you to kill me and take my stuff. And so we have this agreement. And some people will suggest that, well, I don't need a God to understand that there's a utility in that sort of moral arrangement. So utilitarianism is one of the ways that kind of the secular approach to trying to come up with moral guidelines. The problem is that in any one of those scenarios, you end up exchanging a moral lawgiver with might makes right. Because the moment someone says you shouldn't do this, okay, well now you're attempting to impose a particular set of moral codes on me. How do you do that? Well, the left's response to that is, well, we do it through democratic processes.
We do it through government.
Except when you don't like the democratic results from that, right? Because there's been a lot of horrible moral outcomes from democratic processes. Right. So that's the part where it's a little bit difficult. When you ask me, what's the foundation for their moral code? It's interesting. When you ask them that,
they don't know.
They'll try to give you some answer, but it ends up being unwittingly sociopathic.
They'll give you an answer that it's to be happy and to love other people, but then you try
to do the most good for.
But then you going back to definitions, how do you define happiness?
Yeah.
Well, it just makes me feel good. And then, I mean, we've had these
There's some
discussions
people that
before.
feel good about doing some pretty bad things. That doesn't make it
It's
good.
not even just that. It's about the idea that ultimately these things, this is why the left does not like to define things. And it's why on this show, we try to place such great emphasis on trying to define things, even things we don't agree with, because it's important to define things. Because when you don't define things, it is, you're cheating, basically.
Yeah.
And the left does this a lot where they don't define the things that they say that they're in favor of, because when you don't define them, it is so much easier. This is what postmodernism is. It's so much easier for you to make an argument.
Well, it goes back to, you know, I was listening to a conversation about this issue with Charlie Kirk and someone that he was debating. I guess it was a transgender female. I'm not 100% sure, but they were talking about a lot of different things, and it really came back to, well, what's true for you is true to you, and it doesn't matter if I disagree with it, it's true to you, so therefore it should be respected.
But the thing is that that's not what truth is, because
Right.
just because there are some things that are objective truths. It doesn't matter how much I really feel it.
Yeah.
2 + 2 will never equal 5. This is why, like, muddying words, when we play games with the English language, or really any language for that matter, you are opening up a Pandora's box, because we are replacing the word truth with perspective or belief. You can say, my belief is X and your belief is Y, and they're not going to be the same, but that is not what truth is.
Sure.
And so, like, that's why I'm saying that, like, there are some things that are objectively true, like 2 + 2 will always equal 4. It doesn't matter if 100% of the world believes otherwise. If you try to build a car using math that operates on 2 + 2 = 5, that car is going to fall apart the second you press on the gas pedal.
Well,
But the groundwork was done already when this whole idea of just not having a fixed reality and truth is relative really began to be pushed in academia.
Yeah.
And so this whole idea that, well, how do you know that you're really true, that you're really here?
Yeah.
How do you know that? I mean, just getting people to question.
I mean, that's like more deep philosophical.
Right. But once you get somebody to go, well, I guess maybe there is no objective truth.
Well, and there's
they're willing to accept anything at that point.
the problem is that superficially it just sounds so enticing. Oh, it's true for you, and this is true for me, and these are
Let's
both
just be
and
happy
these are
and get
both
along.
equally relevant and equally valid until my truth means I'm hurting you.
Yeah.
Well, then, okay, now who's correct? Because I guarantee you right now, the same person is going, well, what's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. Okay, so what's true for me is I get all your stuff. Is that every bit as relevant?
Well, no, that's where you get the social hierarchies, because from the left, everything's built around power structures, right?
Yeah.
And so at that point, it's well, if your truth is conflicting with my truth and somebody wins and somebody loses, then we need to look at the chart of who's oppressed and who's the oppressor, and we need to rectify the social inequities of the past. And I mean, that leads to a whole nother discussion that doesn't necessarily, that has some overlap with this, but it's not just exclusive to this topic.
When I think, and to address the question, like, why is this being pushed at younger and younger ages? Why is it being pushed? Because they don't consider it pushing necessarily. They consider it informing. And so again, I'm talking about from their perspective. I don't agree with this. From their perspective,
Confirming that the door is open.
well, it's the idea that again, you know, when they say push heterosexuality, we look at that as, well, that's ridiculous. Obviously, you know, heterosexuality, it is a part of the natural order because, I don't know, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't, right? Like, so we find that absurd, but they look at it as, well, okay, wait a second, you're making a moral classification on something that they don't necessarily believe is a moral classification. And if you're imposing that, then from their perspective, you're excluding people who they've already put into a vulnerable category. And so, of course, in order to live in a more equitable society, children need to be re-educated to think about these things differently.
No, not re-educated, because again, it goes back to the blank slate.
The problem is that they have in to some degree failed to re-educate the adult society. So now the push is to educate fundamentally
do we think
the
this
children.
push is centralized from a specific force or group of people?
Well,
I do.
I don't really think, because here
I don't think there's
I
like some. I don't
absolutely
think.
think
I
it
don't think
is.
there's some like grand like Illuminati
Yes, there is.
that's pushing. Well, wait a second.
do they get together at the Arby's every Tuesday?
I don't think. I think what this is that you have a lot of people that feel this way. You have certain like powerful entities that support this. and want to push it through legislation. And is there some
cancel culture? That's one of the biggest ones. Is that you and I can look at something and go, well, I mean, it's right in front of me. I can believe my eyes. I know the truth. And when they basically will gaslight you into, well, you're not seeing the reality, and here's why, and let me give you this splintering definition that isn't a real definition. No, I'm sorry, but I feel like it is more nefarious than. I'm willing to give people the benefit of the doubt to some degree, but there is something nefarious when we suppress data, medical data, when it comes to something we like, but we push medical data when it comes to something we don't like. So if we're talking about medical difficulties and side effects of something that we, that is kind of benign in society, well, then we don't have a problem blasting that all over the news. But if there is something negative with some of these surgeries, or if there's something negative, God forbid, with any kind of inoculation or anything like that, if there's anything negative, they don't share it. They suppress that. So no one can make a real informed decision. And it's interesting to me because when we're talking about some of these testosterone suppressors, it's the same suppressor that for transgender women, biological males who are transitioning to female, that same testosterone suppressant is used to also treat prostate cancer in men. And some of the side effects are so bad that they have to convince these men who are undergoing treatment for prostate cancer that it is better to go through these things than it is to die. But it's the same medication that they're giving to trans people, and they're not giving them same warning.
The side effects may be so bad that the individual with prostate cancer might prefer to just go ahead and die.
Yeah, a lot of them will decide
or to do
not
something else to pick a different type of
No,
treatment.
like when this is one of the normal, it's a testosterone suppression. Okay. Anyway, it is something where they do have to convince these guys. But when you're looking, I feel like there is a bait and switch kind of situation or a bad. It's just done in bad faith. Mm-hmm. When you're not giving the same warning for the same medication because of the person's gender identity, that's wrong. You're tricking that person.
Let me clarify what I think the point Christian and I were making. When the question is there some centralized effort to, of course, there are different interest groups or organizations, or it could be commercial interests that are willing to spread. Of course, nobody's denying that. The thing that I get concerned about is when we start talking about this as, is there some shadowy group that's pulling all the strings from, but I don't.
This is how we lose people, going back to what I was talking about at the very beginning.
It's not just how we lose people, but two, I don't think it's an accurate reflection of how these changes actually take place. Yes, of course, there is always more powerful, influential organizations that take a particular position and then push something. That absolutely exists. I'm not denying that. I don't want people to believe that this is as simple as saying, "Oh, it's this group that's doing this, or this
if you just get rid of these people, this will stop."
If you just stop this one powerful group, you're going to solve. No, you're not. This is a part of an overall approach to how you actually view reality.
Yeah, and it is pushed across a huge segment of society that is very powerful and it's very numerous.
The irony,
you've got the cancel culture, which is very. They use bullying tactics, and they'll shout you down, and they'll call you a bigot. They'll do whatever they got to do. And the entities that push that, they're the ones that.
Well, when we're sitting at home and we're thinking about this issue, our listeners, and there is no logical reason to be pushing things like this on kids in our mind, it is very easy to sit there and think or justify the idea that there may be an overarching force that is centralized. And so I just wanted to bring that up. I think that, a lot of times it's a rational conclusion, but I agree with what you're saying that, we can't always come to that conclusion.
I would say it's groupthink.
Oh, it's social inertia, because there's so many examples of this, and I'll be really quick with this because there's so many other stuff that we still need to get to. But there's so many examples all throughout history of any time that there's a social problem or political problem or whatever it is, there's always the easy answer from a psychological and social perspective is to identify a group of people or an organization or one thing that you can point to physically.
You got to have an enemy.
And say, that's what's causing it.
Right.
So like one of the examples when the disintegration of the Roman Empire was taking place, where there were a lot of people that were saying it was the Christians that were doing it.
Yeah.
They're the ones destroying it, because you could physically point to these people
Right.
and blame them for it. Or it was the Jews that were doing it. You know, and in the 1930s in Germany, it was, all the woes of Germany are the Jews. It wasn't that. It was a bunch of complex economic problems that were taking place, political and economic problems that were taking place that were dismantling the German economy. It wasn't the Jews that were out there conspiring, but it was so easy to feed that to people because you can actually point to a group of people and say they're at fault. You can't point to some invisible force in the market and say that's at fault, even if that's what's really at fault. So like, what I'm saying is that social inertia, the irony being, yes, there are powerful groups and there are powerful organizations pushing this, but the big driving force is social inertia. It is society itself that is pushing this on society.
Well, and I really believe that there are a number of people who feel pushed into agreeing. They don't necessarily agree, but they don't want to get canceled, and they can see what's right in front of their face, and they know it's true, but they're going to repeat the lie. And so my concern is that there are a lot of people. The reason why this has crept up, the reason why it hasn't come to a head and wasn't recognized until kids were sent home and they started seeing this stuff on the Zoom classrooms. I think that is one of the reasons why we haven't seen a pushback. Everybody is afraid to push back.
Nick, I can see myself in a situation going to a family reunion, and one of my cousins is there, and we're having a conversation about this in general terms, and having a difficult time reasoning with someone who holds the position that we should be opening the door or presenting the idea to kids that transgenderism or gender, changing genders is appropriate or fine. And how do I sit there and not think to myself, you're an idiot,
Or you're a bigot.
or you're crazy?
Yeah.
Well,
sorry.
Help us make the argument on that.
So here's what I would tell you. Whenever you look at this issue, again, I think for so many of us in the conservative movement, a lot of this just seems intellectually absurd. It seems like nonsense. What you need to appreciate is that oftentimes when you're talking with somebody about this, especially someone that is very well read up on it, they're going to feel very, very convinced based off of academic language, based off of certain medical language and whatnot, that they are taking the correct position. And a lot of this is rooted. A lot of this is actually rooted in a noble endeavor. Understand what I mean when I say this. The noble endeavor is they see somebody that they feel is vulnerable and marginalized within society, and they feel as if they are coming to their rescue against you, who is treating them like they shouldn't exist, or that they don't really exist, or that this is all a lie. And so they see you as the person that is putting upon or even oppressing this person that is dealing with a complex issue within their own psychology, and they're the ones that are defending them against you. So a couple of things that you have to do right off the bat. First is obviously recognize that might be what you're dealing with. It's not that your friend or your kid from college or whatnot is suddenly just, a nut job, right? They're really trying to do something that could be perceived as very noble. So acknowledge that. The next thing that you want to do is, again, as always, try to define your terms. What do you mean by transgender? Right? And you're not doing this, and you need to assure people of this sometimes. You're not doing this to trip them up or to make them feel stupid. You're doing it because you want to accurately discuss what the issue is and figure out where you might agree or disagree. So ask for that. Can you please define what you mean by this, just so I'm not talking about something that you don't really mean. I don't want to misrepresent what you're saying. And so you have them provide those definitions, or you get to something that's close. But at the end of the day, what transgenderism essentially is someone has a psychological reality with respect to how they perceive themselves, right, which doesn't correspond with their biological reality or their biological sex, right? And that's the conflict that is taking place right now. Here's the other thing that you want to look at this from, and this is really important. Please listen to this. One of the reasons why the left has gained so much traction on this debate is because they perceive conservatives as being mean-spirited, archaic, or cruel when we discuss this issue. And for good reason, because a lot of conservatives have been, because we focus so much on what is considered to be the intellectual inconsistency with the definitions that are presented or the potential problems associated with it. One of the ways that you reorient this argument, and which I hope is not just simply a tactical reorientation, but is true on the reason why you're going about this. So many of us are frustrated by this issue, not because we are attempting to get the government to compel someone to believe what we want or live the way that we want. That's not the issue. It's because when you start talking about how you implement the different procedures or treatments associated with this, we are now talking about kids as young as 9, 10, 11 being exposed to life-altering drugs, pharmaceuticals, potentially surgeries that are going to change their life forever. And we see this as saying, wait a second. It is one thing to have a discussion about this issue. It is another thing to have a discussion about what adults should be free to do or not do. It is something entirely different for adults to be convincing children that because they might have a certain preference in the way that they dress or the way that they talk or the way that they behave or the toys they like to play with, that therefore they must go through life-altering surgical and chemical procedures. That's wrong. There is something just inconsistent about that if you're really going to take the position that you're trying to help a marginalized and vulnerable person. Because I can't think of a more marginalized or vulnerable person than a child that is having some questions, some deep-seated questions about their psychological reality and their physical reality. And our job as adults is to step in and not encourage them to embrace certain life-altering decisions at such a young age where they're going through formative years and they're trying to figure things out. And one of the things that we have to get a grasp of in this whole debate is that is who we are advocating on behalf of. This is not just about certain norms within society. This is not just a question of the government imposing one thing or another thing. This is about us coming in and saying, no, regardless of what you feel about this particular issue, you do not get to push life-altering procedures on a child that statistically has demonstrated they might come back and regret at a later date and never be able to alter. And so that is a big part of what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to protect the innocence of children, both from a psychological component and a physical component. And I think that's a noble endeavor on our part. But if we don't do it correctly, then you will come off as an ignorant bigot. And you're going to have to ask yourself a very important question here. Are you engaging in this debate because you want to make yourself feel better, because you want to own the libs? Or are you engaging in this debate because you genuinely see a real threat to someone that is potentially vulnerable or potentially marginalized? And you are, in fact, advocating on their behalf to make sure that things are not done to them that they can never reverse. And in order to do that, you have to be able to formulate your argument correctly. By all means, advocate for what you believe. Raise your kids in the way that you think that they should go. By the same token, when you're engaging with someone that you find on the other side of this debate, don't automatically assume they're stupid or they're mean or they're bigoted. Right? Try to figure out where they're coming from and then articulate how it is that you also feel that you're standing up for the vulnerable and marginalized.
I think that's a really good point, Nick. You know, I've gotten into a lot of conversations with roommates or friends, people I've gone to high school with or college who I generally disagree with, but have found that I have the ability to carry a constructive conversation with them. And what allowed me to do that was to first realize that this individual holds their opinions just as tightly as I do. Mm-hmm. Now, do I agree with how they got there? No. But I respect that they hold this opinion with a lot of passion. And, you know, you've said before, you know, asking questions will often lead to a productive conversation. And I wish I would do that more often in these conversations, but I think that's really good advice. But, yeah, I think we have a few resources. Tina, you've got one. Nick, you've got one. And, yeah, Tina, why don't you get us started here.
Well, one of the ones we showed the clip of Walt Heyer earlier in the podcast, and he actually has a support website called sexchangeregrets.com. And if you go under the resources portion of that, it's sexchangeregrets.com. They have compiled just a ton of resources for just about any question you might have, and anybody who has gone through this and maybe they're struggling with maybe thinking about it or they're on the other side of it and they'd like to come, back and guess what do you call that when you retransition back?
I think it's detransition.
Detransition. The thing is that we should always provide a really loving environment for people as they're working through some of these things, because oftentimes there is so much accompanying it, and it's really important that we have these conversations in love. But that's the resource I was putting out there.
Yeah, and if you want to watch the interview that we took the clips from, you can go to Heritage Foundation. The actual title of this is "YouTube Won't Allow You to Hear These 6 Words from Former Transgender Identifying Person Walt Heyer." And that was actually done on June 19th, 2020. So it's actually been out there a while now, but that's on Heritage Foundation. If you want to see the full clip, there's actually other people on the panel as well. You can do all of that and learn some more. And again, one of the reasons why I think this is powerful is we don't want to suggest that one person's testimony settles the argument. But a lot of times when you are debating with somebody that is passionate about this issue, it's because they have someone close to them that is maybe going through these issues or considering or contemplating certain decisions. And it is valuable to be able to reference somebody that has gone through similar questions, similar experiences, come out the other side and basically issuing a warning on what this did for them and what this meant for their life and some of the things that were influencing them to make decisions that, really altered them forever. And so I think that can be really valuable.
He has also written many books, which are also mostly like trans life survivors, gender lies and suicide. There's several, and the point of a lot of those is going back to other testimonies of other people and telling their stories.
It's really sad.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, let's go ahead and wrap out here.
Well, again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I know this is a tough issue. We've tried to speak about this in a way that is respectful both of a diverse audience and of the YouTube guidelines. So hopefully we've been able to accomplish that. If you do have other questions, you have other statements or maybe experiences, please leave that in our comments section. We always like to be informed by our audience, as well as potentially helping to inform you about these issues and how to properly make the arguments to be able to defend a free society. Once again, I'm Nick Freitas with our cast and crew here. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next episode.